Ah, skins. There's a lot of skins in this game, aren't there? Some are very popular, some not so much. Last month I made a video about the most popular skin for every champion, according to this poll, and I thought, why not also make one for the worst skins for every champion? So, using the same polls we used for the best skins per champion, now we're going to look at the worst skins per champion. Note that the votes got a bit purged, they're not that many anymore, but the placements of the skins remain pretty much the same for all of them, so we're going to take a look at what's the least popular or, worst skin for every champion, for all champions in the game, like we did for the best ones. So let's begin. Some of them are tied, so I'm going to mention if there are ties. Some skins just got a couple of votes and are tied at the bottom, and also some got the classic skin at the bottom, but we're not going to call the classic skin as the worst one, we're going to call the skin that's at the bottom, not the classic skin, if the classic skin is the worst one, but I'm going to mention them. So, first, Aatrox had his Sea Hunter skin at just 3% of the votes, and his classic skin above that at 4%. Ahri has Dynasty at 1%, she has a lot of skins, but Dynasty got the worst votes so far. Akali has Stinger at just 1%, and All-Star Classic are also at 1%. Alistar has Infernal with just 1 vote, tied up with the classic skin also at 1 vote. Amumu has Pharaoh with just 1% as well. Anivia has Prehistorical, along with Team Spirit at just 1% too. Annie loses with Prom Queen at just 1% as well. Guess she was too young for prom. Aphelios only had 1 skin at the time this poll was made, so Nightbringer fits in here. Probably Nightbringer is going to get less votes now than his new lunar skin anyway. Ashe has Marauder as the least voted skin. Aurelion Sol has Ashen Lord as his least voted skin. And Classic is with even less votes, but we're going to mention the first skin that has the least votes, not the classic one. Azir has Galactic with just 2% of the votes. Bard has Bard with 10% of the votes, and the worst one is his classic skin is just 1%. Blitzcrank also has Classic in the last place, but the first skin with the least amount of votes at only 2% is Rusty. Brent has Crykor with just 1% of the votes. Braum has Lionheart with 2% of the votes. Caitlyn has Arctic Warfare with just 1 vote at 0%. She also has quite a lot of skins, but this one got the least votes in the poll. At least what remain of the votes, since many of them got purged for some reason. Camille has Program with only 8% of the votes, but Classic only has 6. Cassiopeia has Siren with just 1% of the votes, tied up with Desperada at also 1% of the votes. Cho'Gath has Prehistoric with 2%, tied up with his classic skin and with Nightmare as well. Corki has Ulf Rider as his least voted skin, but Classic also has less than that, so 2% and 1%. Darius has Dreadnova with just 1%. Diana has her Dark Valkyrie skin with only 2% of the votes, but the least voted one is still the classic one with just 1%. Dr. Mundo has TPA as his least voted one with 2%, but classic is still voted less here at just 1%. Draven has his Pool Party skin at just 1% of the votes. Echo has his Academy skin with just 1%, and also his classic skin is at 1%. Elise has her SKTT1 skin as the least voted one. Those team skins usually get the least amount of votes, I noticed, but still her classic has the least votes. It's 3% and 1%. Evelyn has her Safecracker skin at just 1%, tied up with classic at also 1%. Ezreal has his Ace of Spades at 1%, tied up with TPA at just 1% as well. Fiddlesticks has his Spectral skin at 2% with just 2 votes remaining after this purge. Fiora's worst skin is apparently Nightraven with 2% of the votes. Fizz Atlantean 1% of the votes, tied up with Classic. Galio with Commando at 1% of the votes, tied up with Hextech. Gangplank with Sailor, tied up with Minuteman at 1% each. Geran with Rogue Admiral at 1% of the votes. Nar with El Leon at 5% of the votes, tied up with Classic at also 5% of course. Gragas loses with Caskbreaker at only 1% of the votes too, and his classic skin is at 6% in comparison. Graves with Riot at 2%, tied up with Higher Gun. Hecarim with Wordbreaker at just 1% somehow. I don't know why, that skin is pretty cool. Heimerdinger has his classic skin at the worst one, but after that it's built over customs at only 4%. Illaoi has her Resistant skin as the worst one with 10%, but it's tied up with Voidbringer, because Cosmic Invoker got 75% of the votes. Irelia has Order of the Lotus as her worst skin, and her classic one is above that with a couple of votes. Ivern has Dunkmaster as his worst skin, and classic is below that too. Janna got the least votes for Frost Queen at 1%, but is tied up with Hextech. Jarvan has his Victorious skin, tied up with his Classic skin at just 1%. Jax has Vandal as the worst one, but it's tied up with Nemesis and Jaximus at 1%, all three of them. Jace has Brighthammer at just 4%. Jhin has his SKT T1 skin at just 1% of the votes, and his Classic skin is above that at 2%. And in comparison, Dark Cosmic had 54% of the votes. Jinx has her Classic skin as the worst one, but above that it's Crime City with only 3% of the votes. Kai'Sa has her Arcade skin tied up with her Classic skin at just 4% as well. Kalista has her Classic skin as the worst one, but above that it's SKT T1 with 9% of the votes. I told you the skins for teams usually get the lowest amount of votes. Karma has Sakura at 1% tied up with Classic. Karthus has Statue with 2% of the votes tied up with his Classic skin. Kassadin has Harbinger at 1% as well. Katarina has a fuck ton of skins, so the least two voted ones are High Command and Mercenary, both at 1%. And in comparison, Battle Queen was at almost 50%. Kayle has Battleborn with just 1%, and Classic is at 4%. Kayn has his Classic as the worst one, and then Soul Hunter at 19%. Kennen has Swampmaster at just 1% of the votes. Kha'Zix has Classic as the worst one, but after that it's Guardian of the Sands with 4% only. And Championship is next with 13%. Kindred has Classic as well, but then is Super Galaxy with only 4% of the votes. In comparison, Spirit Blossom got 86% of the votes. Kled has Sir Kled with only 14%, and his Classic one is above that. Kog'Maw has Deep Sea with just 1% of the votes. I guess that skin is really at the bottom of the ocean. LeBlanc has Wicked with just 1%, and her Classic one is at 5% in comparison. Lee Sin has FPX, I told you those team skins usually get the least amount of votes, at 1% tied up with his Classic skin. Leona has Classic, and then Iron Solari at 1% of the votes. Lilia only has one skin, Spirit Blossom, but it had 80% of the votes. Lissandra has Bloodstone with just 1%, and her Classic one is at 2%. Lucian loses with Classic at 1%, but the first skin is Heartseeker at 2%. Lulu Bittersweet loses at 1% of the votes, and her Classic one is at 2%. Lux also has a fuck ton of skins, but the least amount of votes in this poll, remaining now, is Sorceress with 0% of the votes, which is just one vote. Malphite has Obsidian with 1% of the votes, his Classic one is at 3%. Malzahar has Vizier at 3% tied up with Classic. Maokai has Hunted at 1% of the votes. Mastery has Headhunter tied with Ionia and Assassin at 1%. Misfortune is Waterloo tied up with Classic at 1%. Mordekaiser Classic, but then is King of Clubs at 4% of the votes only. Morgana has Blade Mistress tied up with Sinful Succulents at 1% each. And somehow Classic is on the second place. Nami has Deep Sea tied with Classic at 2% of the votes. Nasus, just like Amumu, has Pharaoh at 2% in the last place. Nautilus has Classic and then Warden at 2%. Nico has Classic and then Star Guardian Prestige Edition somehow at 23% compared to Star Guardian at 46%. Nidalee has Challenger at 1% tied with Classic. Nocturne has Ravager tied with Frozen Terror and Classic at 1%. Nunu has Demolisher at 1% as well. Olaf has Classic at 1%, but then Butcher at 2%. Orianna has TPA as the worst one at 2%, again a team skin. Ornn obviously won with Elderwood, and his Classic skin is the least voted one, but then is Thunderlord with 23%. Pantheon has Full Metal tied with Classic at 1%. Poppy has Ragdoll at 1%, and her Classic in comparison is at 3%. Pyke has his Classic at 1%, and then Sandrate at 15%. Kiana has Classic and then Battle Boss at only 10%. Queen has Phoenix at only 10% of the votes. Rakan has SSG at 1% and Classic at 2%, again a team skin. Rammus has Molten, tied with Classic at just 1% of the votes. Rek'Sai has Pool Party with 11% of the votes. Rel only has one skin, Battle Queen, and it won with 71% compared to 29% on Classic. Renekton has Scorched Earth with just 1% of the votes. Rengar has SSW with 2%, again a team skin, and Classic at 4%. Riven has Arcade with just 1% of the votes. Rumble has Bilgerat with 4% and Classic is at 6%. Ryze has Tribal with 2% of the votes, and Classic is sitting somehow at 11%. Samira also only has one skin, Psyops, and it won with 60% compared to 40% on Classic. Sejuani loses with Dawnchaser at 2% of the votes. Senna has Classic as the worst one and then True Damage at 11%, and obviously she won with High Noon. Seraphine has Classic and then KDA All Out Rising Star as the worst skin. Seth has Mecha Kingdoms at 14% and Classic at 9%. Shaco's worst skin apparently is Mad Hatter at just 1% of the votes as well. Shen has Classic as the worst one with 1%, but then TPA at 2%. Again, another team skin. Shyvana has Bone Claw at just 5%, tied with Classic. Singed Hextech loses with 1% of the votes. Sion has Warmonger at 1% as well. Severe has Warden at 1%. Skarner has Guardian of the Sands at just 4% of the votes. Sona Arcade with 2% of the votes. Soraka Divine with 1% of the votes. Swain Classic is the worst one with 1%, but then the first skin is Bilgewater with 3% of the votes. Sylas only has 2 skins, Classic is the worst voted one, and then is Lunar Wraith with 25%. Syndra has Queen of Diamonds tied with Classic at 1% each. Tam Kench has Classic as the worst one, and then next is Ulf Kench at 19%. Talia has Classic as 1% and then Freljord at 11%. Talon also has Classic as the worst one, and then the next skin is Crimson Elite with 2% of the votes. Tariq has Emerald with just 1%. Timo has Panda as the worst one, tied with Cottontail at 1%. Thresh has Pullfire Prestige Edition with just 1% of the votes, a skin that was pretty damn hated when it came out. Tristana has Classic at 1% and then Earnest Elf at 1% as well, but with a bit more votes. Trundle has Junkyard at 3% of the votes. Tryndamere has Viking at 0% of the votes. Twisted Fate Tango at just 1% of the votes. Twitch loses with Classic with 0 votes and then SSW with 1% of the votes. Again, a team skin. Udyr has Black Belt tied with Classic at just 2% of the votes. Urgot has Classic and then Butcher at just 4% of the votes. Varus also has Classic at the worst one and then Archlight with 2%. Vayne has Vindicator with just 1% of the votes. Veigar Baron von Veigar with 1%. Vel'Koz has Battlecast with 3% of the votes. Vi Debonair with 1% and Classic at 2%. Viego obviously only has 1 skin and there wasn't a poll yet for this, so yeah, only 1 skin. At Victor, we got Prototype with 1% of the votes. Vladimir has Academy with just 1% of the votes. Volibear has Classic and then Runeguard at 4%. Warwick also has a lot of skins, and the baddest skin is Big Bad, because it's bad, apparently, with 1% of the votes. Wukong has Volcanic with just 1% as well. Xayah has Sweetheart with 2% of the votes, tied with Classic. Xerath's Battlecast skin gets annihilated with just 1% of the votes, tied with Classic. Xing Zhao's Viscera skin gets destroyed with 1% of the votes. Yasuo's Project skin got humiliated here, somehow with just 2% of the votes. Yone only had 1 skin and Spirit Blossom won with 78% compared to 22 on Classic. Yorick Undertaker was a very underrated skin apparently with only 2% of the votes. Yuumi had 2 skins, Classic with the worst amount of votes and then Heartseeker with 45%. Zac has Classic at the least one and then Special Weapon with 4%. Zed has Classic on the last place and then SKT T1, what a surprise, another team skin, with 3% of the votes. Zeke says Major with the least amount of votes at just 1% of the votes. Zilean has Time Machine with just 2%, Zoe has Classic, and then Pool Party at 7%, and Zyra has Classic, and guess what, SKTT1 as the least voted skin at 3%. And that's it for the worst or least popular or least liked skins for each champion, at least according to what remains in those polls. I don't know why they got purged. They all had thousands of votes and now some of them only have a couple hundred of votes, so may differ from what it was initially, but should still be enough to make an educated guess of what the least popular skin is for each of those champions. Thanks for watching. Watch also the best skins per champion video if you haven't seen it already. Leave a like and subscribe if you're new here, or I'll find you and I will eat your biscuits and your nose, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.